Someone is telling you about their problems, again, and this time you notice something strange. You listen, you nod, you find the right words. But inside, it doesn't feel quite the same as it used to. That weight you once felt in your chest, that pain that settled inside you as if it were your own, it's still there, but different, more distant, like it's behind a sheet of glass. And somewhere along the way, without really knowing when it started, you began wondering whether you were losing something essential within yourself. You catch yourself reacting differently. Things that once deeply affected you no longer reach you in the same way. People who once had the power to impact you profoundly now seem to pass through your life without truly touching you. You become quieter, harder to reach, colder in your reactions, and that coldness unsettles you because you never chose it. It settled in slowly, almost silently, as if your mind had built this protection without ever asking your permission. Something inside you has hardened, and you still don't know whether it's protection or loss. This is where Carl Jung's ideas become especially meaningful. What you are experiencing is not simple emotional exhaustion. It is not coldness. It is not indifference, and it is certainly not a regression. Carl Jung had already identified this phenomenon. When a deeply sensitive person is wounded too many times, the psyche does not break. It transforms. It reorganizes itself at a profound level, often in the dark, often without you immediately understanding what it is becoming. What you are feeling is not the end of who you were. It is the beginning of something you do not yet recognize. This is not an abstract comfort. It is a real psychological process, one that unfolds silently inside every empath who has given too much, trusted too much, and suffered too much without ever truly protecting themselves. A process that most people go through in confusion and guilt, never fully understanding what is actually happening to them. In this video, you will understand what is really happening inside an empath who has been hurt too many times, why you are becoming calmer but more perceptive, more distant but stronger, and most importantly, why this transformation that worries you today may actually be the birth of the strongest, clearest, and hardest to break version of yourself. The weight no one sees. There is a kind of exhaustion that no one around you truly sees, not the kind that shows on your face, not the kind that disappears after a good night's sleep. It is an exhaustion that settles into the deepest layers of the psyche, accumulating silently, never really finding a way out. For an empath, every intense emotional interaction leaves an imprint on the nervous system, not a conscious memory, a physiological trace. And what most people fail to understand is that your body makes no distinction between your own emotions and the emotions you absorb from others. It processes them all with the same intensity. It carries them all as if they were entirely your own. What makes this process especially draining is its invisibility. The empath continues to function, to give, to be present. But inside, something begins to resemble a container slowly overflowing. The thoughts never stop. Conversations replay in endless loops hours after they have ended. The body remains in a near constant state of alertness because it is already anticipating the next emotional burden before it even arrives. There is also something that very few people talk about, yet it significantly intensifies this overload. An empath does not simply absorb the emotions that are openly expressed. They also absorb what remains unspoken, the underlying tensions, the discomforts that no one else in the room seems to notice. Their inner system is constantly operating on multiple levels at once, which explains why they can feel deeply exhausted after situations that others experienced as completely ordinary. And this particular point is often the first to be misunderstood, even by those who live through it, because this overload is not a lack of strength. It is a sign that something far deeper is about to begin moving within the psyche. The beginning of the shift. At some point, without being able to clearly identify when, something changes in the way the empath sees themselves. It is not a decision. It is not a sudden revelation. It is an accumulation that reaches a breaking point, forcing the inner gaze to turn inward. The empath begins to observe their own reactions with the same attention they once reserved exclusively for others. They notice how many times they were the first to apologize, how many times they took responsibility for tensions that were never theirs to carry, how many times they chose someone else's emotional comfort over their own, not out of conscious generosity, but out of reflex, fear, and deeply ingrained habit. This shift does not immediately produce anger. It creates something more painful and far quieter, a form of lucid sadness in the face of everything that was given without ever truly being acknowledged. Carl Jung referred to this movement as the withdrawal of projection, the process through which a person stops seeking validation for their existence in the eyes of others and begins turning inward instead. It is one of the most important psychological shifts a human being can experience. But what Carl Jung also recognized, and what we are about to explore, is why this moment is almost always accompanied by a deep sense of guilt, and what that guilt reveals about the way the empath has built their identity from the very beginning. The birth of boundaries. The guilt an empath feels when they begin protecting themselves is not insignificant, nor is it irrational. It is a sign that, for years, their emotional availability was not simply a choice. It was a condition they imposed on themselves in order to feel worthy in their relationships. Being there, always, unconditionally, became their way of securing a sense of belonging. And setting a boundary means questioning that silent inner contract they signed without ever fully realizing it. What happens next is subtle, yet decisive. When those first boundaries hold, the empath discovers that the world does not fall apart. The people who genuinely care about them adapt, sometimes awkwardly, but they adapt. And those who disappear at the first sign of resistance may never have been attached to them at all. They may have been attached to what the empath represented, an emotional resource that was always available, dependable, and inexpensive. This distinction between those who value your presence and those who valued your availability is one of the most liberating and heartbreaking realizations this transformation can bring. It completely redraws the map of what the empath once believed their closest relationships to be. There is, however, a very common mistake that empaths make at this stage, confusing healthy boundaries with shutting people out. And that confusion can significantly slow the transformation, or even stop it altogether. We will come back to that. Because before we do, you need to understand what is really happening when those boundaries begin to hold over time. Progressive detachment. There is something about the detachment of a wounded empath that almost everyone misunderstands, including the empath themselves. You may notice it in specific moments. Someone tells you something that would once have cut straight through you, and you realize you are listening differently. You hear the words, you understand the situation. But that immediate pain, that automatic impulse that once made you absorb another person's suffering as if it were your own, is still there, but muted, more distant. And that distance unsettles you because you never sought it out. It settled in on its own, gradually, like a response your psyche built without consulting you. What others see from the outside looks like coldness. What the empath feels on the inside can sometimes feel like a loss, a strange unfamiliarity with themselves, as if they are becoming someone they do not quite recognize. But what this detachment actually represents on a psychological level is fundamentally different. It is not a shutdown. It is a reorganization. The psyche, exhausted from operating without filters for years, begins constructing an inner membrane that allows it to remain present without being overwhelmed. The empath does not stop feeling. They learn to stop allowing what they feel to make decisions for them. Carl Jung described this movement as a central stage of the individuation process, the path through which a person stops defining themselves through the gaze and emotions of others and begins inhabiting their own inner world. It is not a withdrawal from life, it is a strengthening of the self. And this point is crucial because it lies at the heart of a mistake many empaths make at this exact stage of their transformation. They interpret this detachment as proof that they are losing their ability to love, when in reality, it is a sign that this ability is finally being protected instead of constantly depleted. The difference between the two is subtle, but it changes everything about how this period is experienced. And what this period is quietly preparing is something we are going to explore now, because this is where the transformation begins to produce its most unexpected effects. The emergence of discernment. Something remarkable happens when the empath stops indiscriminately absorbing everything around them. The energy that was once devoted to managing other people's emotional overflow begins to redirect itself toward a more precise, more refined function. They develop an ability to read human dynamics with a depth that the emotional naivety of their earlier years never allowed them to reach. They begin to see patterns in people's behavior, to distinguish genuine suffering from suffering used as leverage, to recognize relational imbalances before they become destructive. And what is striking is that this deeper understanding of others is accompanied by a more accurate understanding of themselves. The empath begins to realize, in hindsight, why certain relationships drained them so profoundly, why certain people always returned during moments of crisis and disappeared during ordinary times, and why they kept opening the door anyway. This discernment fundamentally changes the quality of their presence in the world. It is no longer an empathy that is open to everything, porous and vulnerable. It becomes an empathy that is directed, conscious, and capable of connecting without losing itself. Carl Jung referred to this quality as differentiated consciousness, the ability to perceive nuances where most people see only smooth surfaces. And what this consciousness produces at a deeper level is not simply a better understanding of others. It is a transformation in the way the empath sees themselves, the value they place on themselves, and what they are now willing to accept or refuse in their relationships. This stage prepares something that many people do not anticipate, a form of inner strength whose nature is radically different from anything they have known before. The strength born from wounds. What a deeply wounded empath becomes when they move through all of these layers without completely losing themselves is difficult to define with precision. They are not someone who feels less. They are not someone who is less profound. They are someone whose sensitivity is now rooted in something stable, something that no longer depends on the approval of others to remain standing. They can feel without being carried away. They can understand without dissolving into someone else. They can be fully present without betraying themselves. And this combination, feeling deeply while remaining grounded, is one of the rarest forms of inner strength that exists. It is not something that can be taught. It is something forged only through repeated pain and the conscious journey through what that pain creates within. What defines this strength is precisely its silence. It does not seek to impose itself. It does not justify itself. It does not need to convince, because it no longer seeks validation. The empath, transformed by repeated suffering, has not hardened their heart. They have strengthened their inner backbone. They have become someone whom emotional manipulation passes through without truly reaching, not because they no longer feel, but because they now know exactly what they feel and why. They no longer react out of reflex. They respond by choice. And that difference, subtle as it may seem, radically changes the way they experience relationships, the way they move through everyday life, and the way they see themselves in the face of adversity. Carl Jung wrote that one does not become conscious by looking at the light, but by accepting the descent into their own darkness. What the empath has gone through was not destruction, it was a necessary descent. And what they bring back from that descent is something no one can ever take away. What this strength produces at a deeper level is more subtle than most people imagine. It is not a sense of superiority. It is not a quiet form of revenge. It is a different way of seeing, a different way of feeling. The transformed empath does not see more than others. They see differently. And that difference changes what they choose to carry, what they allow to pass through them, and what they now decide is worthy of their attention and energy. This change also transforms their relationship with solitude. It no longer feels like a lack or an absence. It becomes a space where something more authentic can finally exist without being absorbed by the expectations of others. There is no final destination to this transformation, only a way of being with yourself that becomes more stable, more clear-sighted, and more at peace. And you, what wound has transformed you the most on the inside? And what has that pain changed in the way you love or trust others? Share your experience in the comments. Your story may help someone here feel understood in what they are going through. But another question remains. When an empath stops sacrificing themselves for others, do they simply stop suffering? Or do they become someone completely different? The answer is far more unsettling than most people imagine. Click on the video appearing on your screen to find out.